Hello, friends. Welcome. I'm doing my weekly YouTube video a little bit different this week because I've been on vacation the past 2 weeks and I just got back at the end of last week and I really did not feel like filming, editing, and posting a whole video, but I had this great topic, so I was like, let's just do it live and see what happens. Got a pop-up on my screen. There we go. All right, looks like people are coming in. Welcome. Say hello in the chat. Tell me your name, where you're from. If you're a crocheter or a knitter, tell me what you're working on. So as I mentioned, I just got back from vacation. I spent a few days in Algonquin Park, which is we consider it Northern Ontario when we're from Southern Ontario, but it is pretty Central Ontario. And then a few days on Crown land, which is just like federal land that you're allowed to camp on. Spent a few days there and it was really lovely being out there and being back in my camper van. I haven't spent really any time in my camper van in the last couple of years. So it was nice to do that and just completely unplug. And now I am back. Today I am wearing my Fiona Flutter tee. This one I almost never wear and I don't know why. It's just like, it's fun. It reminds me of the little squid or octopus from Finding Nemo who like does this with her tentacles. Anyways, today's topic is all about elevating your crochet garment making game. So I'm going to give you, I just wrote down another tip. So it's going to be 11 ways to elevate your crochet garment making game. That's going to take your stuff from looking pretty handmade to looking like you bought it off the rack. It's going to make it really that much nicer and you'll get even more compliments, hopefully. Okay, let's take a peek. So number one that I wrote down is ensuring you're choosing the right size for your body. You want it to fit the way that it's supposed to fit. So you want to make sure that you're measuring your body correctly, which I did a whole YouTube video on. So make sure you go and check that out. And then that you're choosing your size correctly based on what the designer recommends, based on whichever body measurement you're using. So if they recommend measuring your bust and choosing your size based on your bust, make sure that you're measuring your bust correctly and choosing the corresponding size correctly. That's tip number one. The tips are kind of going to flow from things that you should do before you even start your project down to while you're working and when you finish. And then the last one is actually one that you can consider before you start making your project as well too. And it's my favorite one. Number two, my big recommendation for garments, and this one might get me a little bit of heat, but it's using natural fibers. Using natural fibers for clothing. This is not anything negative against synthetic fibers, and there are so many times and places where synthetic fibers are the right choice, especially if you have allergies to certain natural fibers. And by natural fibers, I don't necessarily mean wool. I also mean cotton, bamboo, linen, things like that. Natural fibers are more breathable, they're more moisture wicking. I personally like the feel of them more on my skin. This top I made out of Lion Brand Trubu, which is a bamboo rayon fiber. It's so silky and soft. If you've never worked with Trubu, it's a dream. So natural fibers are my choice for garments. Natural fibers tend to also give better drape, better movement in your designs than those synthetic fibers. Synthetic fibers are plastic, so they are going to be typically a little bit more rigid and a little bit less breathable. So that's tip number two. Tip number three, also about yarn choice. And this one, I did a poll on my Instagram stories probably a couple months ago now, all about fiber or yarn weights rather. And the the results that I got from that poll actually surprised me because I used to think that my audience liked a heavier weight of yarn like a worsted, but it turns out I have done a little bit of converting and I love it. You are all here for the fingering weights and the DK weights. So that's my third tip, is finding the lighter weights of yarn and patterns that are made using those lighter weights of yarn. Why do I say that? Lighter weights of yarn create a thinner fabric. So again, that fabric is going to be more breathable, and it's going to more closely resemble fabric that you would have in store-bought clothing that's made from actual fabric rather than fabric made from yarn. So the fabric is thinner, it's going to move better on your body again, and it just feels nicer, especially for something like a winter sweater. We think we want to create something bulkier, but the bulkier yarn, two things can happen. If it's a looser gauge, it's actually really holey, and you're going to get that cold winter air through those big holes. Or if you make it a denser gauge, tighter stitches, then it's going to feel like you're wearing a cardboard box. It's not going to move with your body the same way that a DK weight or a fingering weight yarn will move with your body. So that is tip number 3. Definitely lean towards the lighter weights, especially for summertime clothing too. Nobody wants to wear a worsted weight t-shirt. I mean, maybe you do, but I don't. It's so thick. Tip number, where is it on my list? 4. While you're making your piece, especially if you are using indie dyed yarn, I recommend alternating your skeins as you're working. If you're not using indie dyed yarn, you're using bigger box yarn, that's fine. The tip also applies here. Make sure you're buying the same dye lots. You want that little stamp number on the yarn label of the bigger box yarn to match for an entire project. If not, you might end up with some accidental striping or color blocking because those colors might be slightly off from one dye lot to the next. Then with indie dyed yarn, obviously the same thing can happen, and it happens more often because that yarn is being dyed by a person, not just a big machine in a vat, right? So you are going to see more differences in indie dyed yarn than you do in the big box yarn. And that's nothing against indie dyed yarn. I love it. I use it almost exclusively for my designs at this point, but you want to alternate skeins. What do I mean by alternating skeins? I mean, maybe every 2 to 4 rows, you're switching to another skein. So when I get a sweater quantity, say 6 skeins of yarn to make a sweater, I cake them all up and I put them beside each other and I pair them off, a dark looking one, a light looking one, or whatever the accent is in it if it's a variegated. So if it's a speckle, pick one that's really speckly with one that's a little less speckly. Pair them together, and those are the 2 that I alternate with each other. And then I move to the next 2 and then to the next 2. And every 2 or 4 rows, I'm changing from the lighter one to the darker one, or the more speckly one to the less speckly one. That is to create consistency across your whole project. So it's going to help it look less obvious that those skeins aren't a perfect match to each other. You're going to be slowly blending the 2 together instead of going from like this one that's slightly darker to this one that's slightly lighter to this one that's slightly more speckly. And it makes it look a lot more cohesive if you do it that way. Now, I am a hater of having ends in my projects. So when I say that you should switch skeins, I do not mean you should be cutting and reattaching every 2 rows. I just run the yarn up the inside of wherever the seam is on my piece, or along the edge if it's something that's worked flat. And then you either just seam over it if it's on the end, or you wear it on the inside of your piece and you do have a little bit of yarn trailing up the inside of your piece. Not a big deal. It's definitely worth it. It's not that much more work to do, and it will make your piece look a lot better. All right, that was tip number 4. Tip number 5, this one is going to come as no surprise to anyone. Get gauged. Just do it. I have a 5-part video series on gauge. I'm not going to get into it today. Get gauge, block your gauge, check your gauge as you're measuring the pre-blocked gauge so that when you block it, it's blocked to the proper gauge. That's all I'm going to say about gauge because you've all heard me talk about it way too much. Then related to that, and I already said the word, is to block your piece. There's a lot of controversy on the internet about blocking, but there is nothing that is going to get you the same drape, the same comfort, the same relaxation in your stitches and your fibers that blocking is going to get you. I recommend wet blocking all of your garments because at the end of the day, if you're wearing your garments, you are going to have to eventually wash them, which is essentially blocking them. Getting them wet is going to do things to the vast majority of fibers. Now, people will be like, should I wet block or should I steam block? That one, there's a little more wiggle room. So I always recommend wet blocking for fibers like cotton and for fibers that are synthetic, like acrylic. Those ones you should also steam block. After they've been wet blocked and dried, steam block them. Steaming helps to plump up cotton fibers and it helps to soften acrylic fibers. So wet block everything, also steam block others to make them better, cotton and synthetic fibers. Number 7. This one is, it's something that I always used to do in my designs, and then I switched away from it for a little while, and then I switched back to it because it just makes it look so much better. And it is when you're doing a foundation chain, you've got all those little chains, and I know that they can get twisty and annoying and hard to count, but the way you're going to make that first row, that edge of your piece, look the cleanest is to work your first row of your stitches into the back bumps of the chain. If you don't know what the back bumps are, you can Google it, it's out there. But when you make a crochet chain, you essentially have 3 pieces to that crochet chain, and you always want to work through the back bump. That way you get that little loopy V part on the outside, the end of your work, the same way that you do on the top of your work. Keeps those edges nice and clean. Now, the way I strayed away from that for a while was I started using foundation stitches instead of chains at the start of my work. Foundation stitches, I cannot say stitches. Foundation stitches also create a really clean edge, but here's why I went away from foundation stitches for the most part. When you're working something like a top-down sweater, the whole weight of that sweater is resting on whatever you started your piece with. So for a circle yoke sweater, the weight of that whole sweater ends up pulling on that first round of stitches. If those are foundation stitches tend to stretch a lot more than chains do. So that's why I put chains, because it gives a little bit more structural integrity to the start of sweaters. Both have their place. I tend to go with chains and then working in the back bumps, but we're going for that clean edge. Either way, the foundation stitches or the chains will give you that clean edge. Next, number 8. Ooh, this one's a big one. Okay, this one I do in all of my patterns that are in joined rounds. It is joining your piece with a tight slip stitch at the end of each round. A tight slip stitch helps to bring together that seam and make it less noticeable. If you're just doing a regular 2-gauge, nice loose slip stitch, you end up with this little boop gap at the start of every round. And when you do that, you end up with this little gap all the way down your piece. And it makes the seam really obvious. In crochet, there's no real good way to get rid of the seam entirely in rounds that are joined. Continuous rounds, obviously there's no seam, but joining with a tight slip stitch really helps to bring that seam together. And then you need to work into each stitch all the way around. So sometimes designers or crocheters will count those turning chains as the first stitch. In my color work sweaters, I count them as the first stitch, but all of my other sweaters, I do not count them. I don't count them because they're so much narrower, and when you do the tight slip stitch, they just snug right up to that first stitch. Say it's a double crochet. So it just ends up being like a slightly thicker double crochet, and it just makes the seam cleaner. Here's a bonus tip that I just thought of. I've also noticed a lot of designers putting the seam of things like circle yolks down the center back. Designers, if you're watching, start putting that seam on kind of like the raglan line, a diagonal line down the back shoulder, because then when you reach the body, you can run it right down the side of the body and it's so much less obvious. If you're a maker and you have a pattern that from a designer that has it down the back, you could probably shift the math a little bit to make it run down the diagonal of the sleeve instead, or just buy my patterns because that's how I do it. That was a little bonus tip. Moving that seam to a less visible spot. Yes, it'll always be visible on the yoke, on that raglan line, but it's not super visible. And then if you can run it down an underarm, so much cleaner. Same thing with the sleeves. I run my seams of my sleeves on the underside of the sleeve rather than right down the center on the top. Okay, I forget where we were. That was 8. Number 9, don't be afraid to go off script. This is something that I've realized, especially crocheters versus knitters, we're so attached to getting every single stitch exactly how the designer did it. Did she pull up the loop here or pull up the loop there? Why does that look different? It's okay for you to go slightly off script, especially if it's a tweak for your body. Say your body doesn't correspond perfectly with the Craft Yarn Council or Isolde sizing chart. You're allowed to add extra stitches or remove stitches or put in waist shaping into any design. You can do that. It's your clothing. You can do whatever you want. Don't be afraid to go off script. If you are afraid to make those modifications, you could try reaching out to the designer. A lot of designers will help with minor modifications, especially if it's something that is unique about your body that you need to modify for. I will always help with things like that. Like if your bust is a medium, but your bicep is an extra large, I'll help you to figure out where to put extra stitches in to make it fit your bicep. I buy your patterns, but have been too intimidated to make them. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Don't be intimidated. I promise, just try. I do have, where would you find that? I have a flow chart of my circle yoke sweaters from easiest to most difficult. I forget where you would find that. Send me a DM or an email and I'll send it to you. Also, my patterns on my website are shoppable by difficulty level. So if you go to my website, there's a drop-down menu at the top that says shop by weight/skill. Click that, click beginner. Since you have some of my patterns already, see which ones are in that beginner section and start with one of those. I promise you can do it. You can absolutely do it. You've got this, Yarn Doc. Okay, we were talking about, going off script. Yeah, don't be afraid to go off script. If your stitch count is off by 1 or 2 stitches, fudge it. It doesn't matter. If you're not liking how something is fitting, alter it. If you're liking how something is fitting, but your stitch count or row count is off, keep going. The point is that you're making something at the end of the day that you want to wear. So go off script if that is the case. Then number 10 is working trim over rough edges. Now this one doesn't have any of those rough edges because it's got the clean chain or foundation stitches here, and at the bottom. But let's say you're working a tank top or a t-shirt that has sleeves that are attached to it. And you have, tank top, we'll go with tank top. So you have these short little rows when you start, they just to make the sleeves, straps. Then when you're working them, especially if they're double crochet, the edges kind of look like this. They're a little bit wonky, they're a little bit rough. They're not clean like they are in knitting, right? Knitting, those edges tend to be really nice and straight and clean. Crochet, unfortunately, there's very few ways to get those edges perfectly straight. So you'll notice in all of my tank top patterns that I have trim on the edges. And that is typically at least just one round of single crochet stitches around the opening or around the edge that has that rough edge, because one row starts with the chains, one row ends with the stitch, right? So it's going to be rough. I use single crochets because they're easy, they're small, they're not really adding width to, say, a tank top strap. You'll have to play a little bit to know how many single crochets to work into the edges of your rows. It'll also depend on what stitch you're using, if there's a stitch repeat. Let's talk about the basic ones. If you're doing single crochet straps, I usually do 1-to-1. So I'll work one single crochet into the end of each row around. If it's half double crochet, let's say it's 2 rows of half double crochet, I'll probably work 3 single crochets into those and then kind of skip the next one and then 3 single crochets into the next 2 rows of half double crochet. Double crochet is the one that's trickiest for me, and I alter this based on my gauge and how tall my stitches are. And that depends on a number of factors, but usually for double crochet, anywhere between 2 single crochets per row, or I think I've done in 3 rows of double crochet, 5 single crochet stitches across 3 rows. It varies a little bit. Play with it. Single crochet around your opening or along the edge of your piece. If you like how it looks and it's not pulling your fabric tight and it's not looking all ruffly on the edge because you've put too many single crochets, then that's the sweet spot. You want to make sure, that it's not too many stitches, because it'll make that edge look even rougher, or too few stitches is going to cinch that fabric in. There is a sweet spot there. It does take a little bit of playing to get it just right. Now, the last one, and I literally just added this to my list like 5 minutes before I tapped go live, is to pick something slightly out of your comfort zone. And I saw your comment there, Yarn Doc, and I was like, that's exactly my last point, is picking something slightly out of your comfort zone. You don't want to pick something that is so far out of your comfort zone that you just don't make it, right? We want to pick something that is attainable for us. If it's too challenging and too difficult, we might be intimidated by it and not make it. If you pick something that you have the skills for, but maybe there's 1 or 2 skills that you haven't learned yet or haven't tried yet, that's the perfect one. Building those skills is going to also get you crocheted garments in the end that look more like clothing you buy in a store, because when it's a garment like 2 rectangles sewn together for the body and 2 rectangles or 1 for each sleeve, those are very beginner friendly designs, but they are just never going to fit our bodies the way that clothing from the stores does, because our bodies are not rectangular. They're not one-dimensional. We're 3-dimensional. We have moving parts, and therefore our clothing should be pretty dynamic with that as well too. So choosing a garment that is slightly out of your comfort zone, and then again, and then again, and then again. Next thing you know, you're working on a fingering weight dress with lace and short rows and all of these things, and it looks incredible. So constantly pushing yourself to try new things is going to elevate that crochet wardrobe in the long run. Try buttons, try zippers. Don't be afraid. Maybe don't do them all at once. I did that to myself recently. I agreed to do a knitting test, and I'm not a great knitter. I always classify myself as a beginner knitter, and I did not do my due diligence in asking questions about this pattern. I just saw it and I was like, that's beautiful. I'm going to test it. And next thing I know, I'm doing like 2 different types of short rows and like twisted stitches, and it was overwhelming. It was definitely overwhelming. And that's not where you want to be. You don't want to be overwhelmed and drowning. I got through it, but it took a lot of concentration. It took a lot of time. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. That would not be the route that I would recommend taking, because I took it myself recently, earlier this year, in testing a knit sweater that was way out of my depth. Working on your Odette cami right now. Awesome. Thank you. That is one that has that single crochet trim around those rough edges. Just cleans them up. So that is all of the tips that I had. I always planned on this being like a short and sweet little live. I wanted to keep it in the 20 to 30 minute range, and we're right around 25 minutes. So I think I am going to wrap it up and say goodbye quickly again. Measuring yourself correctly and choosing the right size, using natural fibers, using lighter weights of yarn, alternating skeins and matching dye lots. Where's number 5? Oh, get gauge, keep those stitches consistent, measure your gauge as you're working. 6, block your final piece, block your gauge. 7, chain and work into the back bumps of chains to start. 8, use tight slip stitch seams. 9, don't be afraid to go off script. 10, work trim over the rough edges. And 11, step out of that comfort zone. Thank you all so much for watching. I think this is the most number of people I have ever seen in one of my lives. So thank you all for being here. Happy crocheting. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.